I shared that story with me about prayer and the hurdles that I overcome or have to overcome. And I gotta say, a lot of times I am wondering what went wrong. Why I feel the way that I feel. Sometimes I wonder if I were more faithful or stayed a bit more churchy, is that a word? A bit more covenant relationship minded. You know what? How about I just say, if I stayed a bit more like Hannah. Welcome back, everybody, to part 2 of the Convert Me podcast. And that is the Book of Ruth. It is quickly becoming one of my favorites. It seems the more that I go along in the Bible, the more and more favorite books that I am finding. Believe it or not, I was a big fiction reader, and I would just, that was what I'd read. I'd play video games, I would listen and read all sorts of books, and lately, I'm telling you, my time has been dedicated towards scriptures, and I can't seem to pull myself away from it. What I'm trying to say is that there is definitely something to studying the scriptures. I don't know if you play any video games, but I played a lot of video games. And you're like, oh, well, I just don't see reading and studying the Bible for me. I thought the exact same thing. I'm not saying I'm trying to convince anybody otherwise. I'm just trying to let people know that I was in that same boat, and look at me now. I'm doing a podcast on the Bible. I'm trying to exemplify the transformative power here. So if you know anybody who is in that same situation, I'm sure that they would be very interested in learning about a podcast by converts of the church who weren't always followers of Christ. And it's a podcast for converts or interested people. It's a very simple to follow along, and I hope that you're enjoying the podcast so far. But let's get into Samuel, shall we? So Samuel will have 2 books. We have 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, but we are now in 1 Samuel, and this book has a lot. It's got a lot of corrupt priests. There are lots of lessons about worshiping, lots of battles. We're going to get into some battles if that's more your thing. And we're going to focus a lot on repentance. We're going to focus a lot on hearing God. And we're going to focus a lot on prayer. Because prayer is, I believe, one of those advanced things. I mean, yeah, sure, it's the most simplest thing, right? Maybe you know people that were brought up in the church and they were taught to pray every day as children. Well, you know what? Us converts did not. Not a lot of people did. And even if you were raised in the church and taught to pray every meal or every day, it doesn't exactly mean that you've mastered the art. I mean, yeah, sure, there's not much to master. You are talking to God, you are building that relationship, and it doesn't sound that difficult, does it? Well, for me, I guess I should speak for, it can be. There are definitely hurdles, and there are things that make it difficult, which is why I find this story very interesting and very important. So let's go ahead and open up our Bibles. We are on 1 Samuel 1, chapter 1, verse 1. And verse 1, it says, "There was a man who lived in Ramathaim, and his name was Elkanah." And then it goes right on to verse 2, and it says, "He had 2 wives. The first was Hannah, and then the second was Peninnah." Now, I know what you're thinking. Illegal. But, polygamy is a common thing in the Bible, and I'm not saying that it's right. I'm not saying that was God's will. In fact, quite the opposite. It was not God's will. But unfortunately, people are imperfect and don't always live exactly to word for word with God's word. So that's what's happening. And but yeah, so won't spend too much time on that. What we are going to spend time focusing on in this first part, so this book will have lots of lessons, and this is just the first lesson, and it's a lesson about prayer. It's a lesson about having a covenant relationship with God. And we are reading that every year, this man, Elkanah, with the 2 wives, would travel from his hometown up in Shiloh, and he would worship and offer sacrifice to God of the angel armies. Now there, at the temples that he would sacrifice, was a priest by the name of Eli. And Eli plays a big part in this lesson, and we learn that he has 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas. And Hophni and Phinehas are very worldly. They're very greedy. They are not exactly what you would think about when you're reading in verse 3 when it says that they served as priests of God there. So those were 2 of Eli's sons. And when Elkanah, the man with the 2 wives, whenever he would go and do the sacrificial meals, and he would pass them around to his wife, Peninnah, and all her children, he would give an especially generous helping to Hannah, the other wife, because he loved her so much. And it says here, because God had not given her children. So we already take away that Peninnah has a lot of children, but Hannah has no children. And this basically went on year after year, and this really drove Hannah to a bad place. I guess it would drive a lot of us to a bad place, right? Could you imagine what she's going through with a second wife that she's, they don't say they're competing. Well, they kind of do. Let me see here. They call her an adversary. Okay, right here, verse 6. Different translations will say different things, but in here, the Message Bible, it actually says... Alright, so verse 6, the Message Bible, it actually says that her rival wife taunted her cruelly, rubbing it in and never letting her forget that God had not given her children. So, I guess that does give us a good example of what their personal lives are, what they're going through, and just the bad environment of a polygamy marriage, because that's what they're going through. She's trying to have children. The rival wife has all the children, and she's rubbing it in. And Elkanah, right? He is, I don't want to speak badly, but it is kind of humorous because Hannah starts crying. I'd imagine she's always crying. And a lot of times she doesn't eat. She'll cry, she'll lose her appetite, she doesn't eat. And Elkanah, he sees this and he says, Hannah, why are you crying? Why aren't you eating? Okay, side note, he knows that she's trying to have children but can't, right? And he knows that what's going on between them. All right, so just keep that in mind. So he says, why are you so upset? And then he says, am I not worth more to you than 10 sons? So it's like, yeah, I know that you can't have sons and you're trying to have sons, but hey, you got me. Isn't that worth more than 10 sons? It almost gives like a Gaston from Beauty and the Beast vibe. You always got your nose stuck in some sort of a book when you should be focused on more important things, like me. So Hannah is obviously distraught, and she prays to God. Hannah is an incredibly faithful woman, and apparently not a lot of people think that she is. And I will explain why I think this. Because she continuously prays to God. And at this particular time, she made a vow. She prayed to God and she says, "Oh God of the angel armies, if you take a good hard look at my pain, if you'll quit neglecting me and go into action for me by giving me a son, I'll give him completely, unreservedly to you. I'll set him apart for a life of holy discipline." And like I said, different translations. This is a very English, very, very modern translation. Your version might say something along like, I will give him to you, and I will not cut no razor will touch his head, which means he'll never cut his hair. He will be in service of God. But yeah, so that is verse 11. And the next verse, we see that she continued in prayer before God, but the priest, Eli, was watching her closely. And Hannah was just praying, and she was praying silently. So her lips was moving, but no sound was heard. So as I'm saying, yeah, they're priests, and we have this automatic way that we think of them, but we're learning that it's not so much. All right, so Eli, he sees her praying, but he doesn't think she's praying. He approaches her and he says, "You're drunk. How long do you plan to keep this up? Sober up, woman." And Hannah says, No, please. I am not drunk. I've not been drinking. I've been going through a lot of hard times. I'm a woman hard used, and I haven't had a drop of wine or beer. And the only thing I've been pouring out is my heart, pouring it out to God. She tells Eli, don't think that I'm a bad woman. It's because I'm so desperately unhappy and in such pain that I've stayed here so long. And the priest Eli answers her. He says, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel give you what you have asked of him." And she says, "Think well of me and pray for me." She says, "Don't think bad of me. You're thinking bad of me. Think well of me and pray for me." And now we are in verse 20, and it says that Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel. And Samuel means asked of God, or God heard, or in this translation it says, I asked God for him. So we're learning about the power of prayer from Hannah. She has gone through a very difficult time, and all she could do was talk to God. The only thing she can think of to even try to better her situation was talk to God. And it seems like a last resort kind of a thing, but when really it should be the first line of defense, right? Well, we can take a look at this story. Sure, it's great. And we can also still have difficulty. And we all have difficulties with prayer for our own reasons, whatever those reasons may be. And me personally, I'm trying to come to terms with mine. And I guess I could share. I'll share, because I already shared that I already have a difficult time. But I guess I didn't tell you why. Well, as a kid, I grew up, I guess poor. I want to say poor, but as a kid, you don't care about those things. That wasn't your mind frame. You just have your family, your friends, and that's it. But I guess for us to understand the situation, yeah, sure, poor. But one day, we lost everything. The house, we watched both of our cars get towed away for the repo man. We're just watching from our window, and next thing we knew, that we're moving into Grandma's house. And I didn't care about not having money. Like I said, as a child, you don't really care about those things. But what I did care, what really bothered me, was moving into Grandma's house. I loved Grandma, I loved my family, but I could handle being poor, just us by ourselves. But I couldn't handle being poor around my family. It was more embarrassing. There was more of a pride hit. There was a vibe kind of a thing, like we'd stay to one side of the family, but we knew that everybody knew what was happening and what we're going, and I don't know, I felt like we were treated differently. Anyway, that's getting way off course, but so yeah. And all that I'm telling you, when I hated it, I would pray to God in tears and anger, and that, just like Hannah, it's all I could do. I felt it was my last resort, and it was the only thing that I can do as a child. And I would pray, please, I would do anything. Get me out of here. I felt like that movie SWAT, with Colin Farrell and the bad guy who's being hauled into jail when he's finally captured, and he goes on live news television. He goes, "I will pay $15 million to whoever gets me out of here." So, that's basically how it was. I was so angry. And so, yeah, and that was my prayer. I would make deals, I guess, covenants, right? Okay, if you help my dad make money, I would do this, I would do that. And you know what it always was? My part of the deal? It was just being good, right? That's all I could do. That was all I could think of to do. That was my deal. Like, okay, dad gets all of this money, he gets us out of here, and I will be good. How about that? And, well, what I come to learn is that, yeah, I think God wants me to be good. But what I think he appreciated more was me trying to build that relationship, that covenant relationship. And I'm telling you, you may not believe me, you might think I'm crazy, you might think all of this, but for some reason, I don't know how, my dad went on a business trip and he came back with a big check and a lot of money and a new business that he just started. Darnest thing, I'm telling you. And, I was out of school for like a year. I was just held back because I couldn't get to school. We moved across the island. We were living in Hawaii and there was just no way for me to get to school. And I don't know why I didn't transfer schools, but it was just a big thing. So I was just out of school for the longest time, just sitting at home eating fried rice. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, he's got this company he's putting together and he's making all this money. And I'm going to buy a brand new truck and I'm going to high school with graduating high school, in a brand new truck. And it's crazy. I'm telling you, miracles happen. But you're thinking, okay, why is it so hard for you to pray now? Didn't it work? It did. It did work. But not the way I wanted it. I think that it was possibly the worst thing that's ever happened to me. Yeah, I'm sure it's, playing my violin, but I'm just telling you, that's my hurdle that I'm getting over. Like, gosh, I wish we didn't have all that money because it affected our family in a lot of ways, affected my dad in a lot of ways. And at the same time, I'm thinking, wait a minute. I'm asking myself, did I keep my end of the deal? Was I good? I like to think I was, but of course I made mistakes. There were times where I did stray, and I just don't know. I can go back and forth and drive myself crazy over it, but I'm just letting you know that because of that experience, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, I will pray, but I won't ask for anything. It's like, no. I appreciate it, but I think I'm good. I will just try my best. And that's the hurdle that I'm going through. And everybody has their own hurdle. I just shared mine. And so Hannah, she has her hurdles as well. Right? She couldn't have a child. She used the power of prayer, and now she's got one. And she named him Samuel. And she tells her husband that after the child is weaned, I'm going to bring him myself. I'm going to bring him myself and present him before God. And that is where he will stay for good. That was her deal. That was her covenant relationship that she made. She said, okay, you give me this son, and I will give him to you. He will be of service to you just like me. I said, you let my dad make all this money and I'll be good, right? There is a invitation and there is a result a lot of times with God. God will give us an invitation and he will promise a result. And it's up to us to decipher that, hear it, and take it for what it is. And here we are seeing Hannah taking up her end of the deal. And Elkanah, he's supportive. He says, do what you think is best. Yes, let God complete what he has begun. And so she brings Samuel to Shiloh, and she's bringing also a generous sacrifice meal, a prize bull, and flour and wine. And the child is so young, super young. And they bring it to the priest, and they butchered the bull and gave Samuel to Eli. And verse 26, Hannah says, excuse me, sir, would you believe that I'm the very woman who is standing before you at this very spot praying to God? And she's trying to tell Eli that she's the woman he thought was drunk. And she tells him in verse 27, I prayed for this child and God gave me what I asked for. And last verse, it says, and now I've dedicated him to God. He's dedicated to God for life. Then and there, they both worship God. And that was chapter 1. I shared that story with me about prayer and the hurdles that I overcome or have to overcome. And I gotta say, a lot of times I am wondering what went wrong, why I feel the way that I feel. And a lot of times I don't have a good answer. The only answer I can think of is that it wasn't that I was bad, but I wasn't keeping up my covenant to maintain that relationship. And I just think for me personally, church would have helped a lot. But I always have somewhat of a envy to people born in the church and their upbringing and how everything was so structured and planned. But that's beside the point. What I'm trying to get to is that sometimes I wonder if I were more faithful or stayed a bit more churchy, is that a word? A bit more covenant relationship minded. You know what? How about I just say, if I stayed a bit more like Hannah? Because here we read in Samuel chapter 2, verse 1, it says, Hannah prayed, I'm bursting with God. I'm walking on air. I'm laughing at my rivals, and I'm dancing my salvation. And that is the power of prayer. And we can actually easily overlook something that I just want to really quickly point out, because what is actually happening right now? Hannah had her son, and she now gave up her son to God. And that sounds super great, but I can't help but think, wouldn't that be somewhat of a trial? Wouldn't that be somewhat of a challenge? Giving up your only son. She's left him with Eli. You'd think that you would be a bit sorrowful. You'd be a little bit sad. But we are seeing that Hannah returns to prayer, and she is just bursting. She is ecstatic. She is just praising God. And maybe if I stuck with how Hannah is right now, always giving the thanks to God and the glory to God, because when my wishes came true, when God's part of the deal that I made with him as a child got fulfilled, I was not bursting with God news. I wasn't walking on air. I wasn't dancing my salvation. How many times do we actually do as Hannah, and we are so happy when these sacrifices of ours are made, when our times of trial have come full circle? How many times do we stop and just celebrate? I'm thinking of that right now, and it's just like hurdle is done with. I'm on to my next hurdle. What now? It's like an endless cycle. But if we end that cycle with dancing our salvation, laughing at our rivals, and just walking on air with glory and thanks to God, how different my life would be. How often can we say that we've overcome the trials and gave thanks to God? And I'm not even talking about huge life-altering things, even though mine was. I was a kid, and I should have done this. But I don't know. I can't explain it. I don't know why it's only taken me till almost 2 years to get baptized and follow the church and really strengthen my relationship with God. I don't know why, but here we are. And God is good all the time. And we are on Samuel chapter 2. Hannah is ecstatic. She is so happy that she just gave her son to Eli, and now he is God's. There are other instances in the Bible of great people celebrating in the face of adversity and in their greatest challenges. Well, look at Jesus. Before he got arrested, Jesus sang a hymn with his disciples. And this was before he went to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he would be arrested. Or how about David? We've talked about David in our past episode. King David. How many times has David praised in the face of his greatest challenges? I guess what I'm trying to get at is, I heard this great saying, I don't know where it's from, you've probably heard it, but it's about how often we use prayer as a seatbelt when we should be using prayer as the steering wheel. And I am continuously trying to work on this. Like I said in the beginning, it is one of my greatest hurdles, and I still have difficulty with this. I have a coworker, and at lunchtime, I see him bow his head and he prays. Doesn't matter who's in there, doesn't matter who's watching. And I always have a deep admiration for that, and always admire the strength that takes. And hopefully one day I can be like that. But it is a hurdle that I have to overcome. It's a challenge. I'm sure we all have them. Unfortunately, not everybody is as faithful as Hannah, as we will read later in this chapter about Eli's two sons who are still continuing to rip off the people, and not only the people, but sleeping with women, stealing from God. They are the ones that are taking his sacrifices and eating his portions. And there is a nice nugget here that I like to think about, and it is verse 25, and it says, if you sin against another person, there's help. There's God's help. But if you sin against God, who is around to help you then? And we will see that God, he has plans. He is not blind to the situation, and he has plans to take care of them. And God actually tells Eli that, be well warned, I will wipe out both your family and your future family. No one in your family will make it to old age. And he also says that his two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, will be the proof to what he says is true will happen, because they both will die the same day. And then he says, you'll see good things that I'm doing in Israel, but you'll see it and weep, for no one in your family will live to enjoy it. And I just want to go off on a side tangent. This whole seeing it and weeping, we've seen this with Moses, and we see it again, both times used as punishments. And I am here to tell you, to testify that is a real punishment. As somebody who has gone so much of his life without God, without church, without God, I wasn't some godless tyrant or some terrible person, but without the gospel and without the church and without that constant effort and support from the church and the people in the church. And I'm here to testify, to give you my testimony that I receive this punishment so often. And I see what could have been, and I see why it's not. I see where I could have been, and I see why I'm not. I see people, and it's just, I couldn't put it into words until I started reading the Old Testament again. I'm thinking, wow, yeah, that is a punishment, definitely. That's for sure. And it is a hard pill to swallow. But I guess what I'm trying to say is to not take for granted. If you're listening, I know it's a podcast for converts, but it's not only for converts. I'm hoping people in the church are listening who are longtime followers. Maybe not take for granted these simple things that your parents have worked so hard to bring you up in a good, faithful upbringing of faith and religion and the Word of God and all of the guidance that comes with. And if we're not born and raised up in the church, and if we are converts or new to the church or want to become in the church, or even that we were in the church but don't feel like we were ever a part of the church, that there are times that we may see our regrets and all of that, and we may see people thrive in their environments because of their upbringings, because of timing, because of their position in life. And we may see all of these things, and it can drive us a little bit up the wall. But I'm here to give you my testimony that just as in verse 1, as Hannah gave her only loved son that she prayed so hard for, and now she's given him up without a second thought. And she's bursting with God news. And she's walking on air, even though some things may seem like punishments, and these are trials that we are going through, and we're just hanging in there. Like I was saying in the past episodes, we're just searching the Bible, going through, looking for these life lessons, looking for these nuggets. And just as Hannah is celebrating and dancing in her salvation, that we can take this lesson and and just know that it's not over. Things are not set in stone quite yet, and that there are more stories of prospering than there is of crashing and burning. And I think one of the most repeated phrases in the Bible is to not be afraid. So I think it's very important to remember as we close off chapter 2, because after he tells Eli all of this, he says in verse 35, "Then I will establish myself a true priest. He'll do what I want him to do, be what I want him to be. I'll make his position secure. He'll do his work freely in the service of my anointed one." And that is another thing that I really like with the scriptures. You can often find an invitation and a result, an invitation and a reward. You do this and this will happen. You do this and this will happen. And this is God saying he is going to do this and this is what will happen. And we see a balance. So that gives me hope. That gives me a lot of encouragement. So let's go on to chapter 3. 1 Samuel chapter 3. So in chapter 3, we are focusing on Samuel. Now, I don't believe that we talked much about Samuel yet up until this point, other than he is faithful. But I don't think we talked about how faithful he is. It doesn't say exactly how old he is, but a lot of people believe he's about 12 years old. And he is so faithful that we are about to read that God chooses his faithfulness over his other priest servants. And even as much as Samuel has served and worshiped God, he is 12 years old and he doesn't quite know God's voice yet. And here I am talking like, oh, he doesn't know God's voice yet like we do. Right? Because, do we know God's voice for that matter? Are we able to tell? Are we able to discern the voice of God? Would we be able to if we ever heard it? Or if we do hear it? Maybe we hear it in our lives every day and we just can't discern it. We're like, oh, we can't shut out the worldly noise to hear God's voice. Whatever the problem that we may have that is making it difficult for us to hear God's voice. Because hearing God's voice is so important. It's one of the marks of a faithful servant. It's an attentive ear and an immediate response. And this is what's happening to Samuel. He's never heard God's voice yet. However, the Lord is speaking to Samuel. He speaks to Samuel 4 times. But the first 3 times, he thinks Eli is calling him. And we are seeing God's patience and his love. And he is not getting frustrated. He's not thinking, oh, is this deaf ear boy? It's me, it's not him. Or whatever it may be thinking. He's not getting frustrated. He's not angry. He is very patient, very loving. And he continues to reach out to Samuel. And I just hope that we know that is the sort of patience that we should come to expect to know and to love. We might be thinking, oh, but that's Samuel. He's so faithful. He is a strong servant of God. That is why he gets that extra grace, and he's so patient with him. But I think it's important to remember that we are all God's children, and God is the same God as Abraham, Isaac, Moses, Jacob, Joshua, and we need to remember that we are not so different, that we are all in the same tribe. And when Samuel went to Eli, because he thought he was calling him, Eli did a great thing and gave Samuel some really good advice. And he said, the next time that happens, you say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." But it's very interesting to note that when God called again, Samuel left out the Lord part, and he only said, "Speak, I'm your servant, ready to listen." And like we were just talking about, Samuel doesn't know God yet. He doesn't know who he's talking to yet. So he leaves this part out. was very interesting to know, and I think very cool to share, very good, interesting nugget for you, is that as God calls Samuel's name, we can reflect to the New Testament, John 10, verse 3 and 14. And when God calls out Samuel's name, we can remember that the shepherd calls his sheep by name to get their attention. So this is John 10, verse 3. It says, the gatekeeper opens the gate to him, and the sheep recognize his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And verse 14, John 10, it says, I am the good shepherd. I know my own sheep, and my own sheep know me. And as God speaks with Samuel, and Samuel gets to know God, and hearing his voice, knowing his shepherd, and God knowing his sheep. And this may sound just like a story, but this is exactly what happens. We build that relationship, and it's a great relationship that we work in our lives to maintain, to strengthen. It is a great thing. And as God is talking with Samuel, he is telling him what's going to happen. And he's telling him all about the evil of Eli's family and how they're about to be wiped out. And in the morning, Eli's very curious what God was saying, what Samuel now knows. So he says in verse 17, what did he say? Tell it to me, all of it. Don't suppress anything or soften one word. As God is your judge, I want it all, word for word, as he said it to you. And God was saying terrible things of what's going to happen to him, things that you wouldn't want another person to know. And Samuel told him. He told him everything about him, everything about his sons, everything about his family, and it was nothing good. Frightening, in fact. But Eli isn't completely godless. He isn't completely evil. He isn't like his sons. He's not perfect, but he's definitely not like his sons. So Eli says, he is God. Let him do whatever he thinks. Maybe a rash person or a normal, I don't know, normal, define normal, right? Maybe a typical person would be like, oh no, and they'd kick and scream and then they'd panic and try to prevent this from happening. But Eli says it's God's will. He knows what's best. What will happen will happen. And just as Joshua opened up the sea, just as Moses opened up the sea, just as the people recognized their true prophetic power of God through those acts, everyone in Israel, from Dan to the north of Beersheba in the south, recognized Samuel as the real thing, as a true prophet of God. And God continued to show up. They continued this relationship and continue to be revealed through his word to Samuel. All right, now let's turn to chapter 4 because a lot is happening. I almost feel like now that Samuel has been recognized as a true prophet, there is a false sense of strength here. They're forgetting that there's still a price to be paid. And it's about to be paid because war breaks out. There was a big war. And this is actually when Eli's family will pay the price. Because I guess maybe they thought they were super strong because they had God on their side. But maybe they just didn't know that God was not on their side. He was not happy with what was going on. There is still work to be done. And so the two sons of Eli in this war both died. But not only them, about 4,000 soldiers were left dead on the field. But that's not the end of it, because we read in verse 10, it says, and did they ever fight? It turned into a rout. They thrashed Israel so mercilessly that the Israelite soldiers ran for their lives, leaving behind an incredible 30,000 dead. And this was the battle where Hophni and Phinehas were killed, and glory was exiled from Israel. So now maybe they're feeling like something isn't right. They're taking beatings, terrible losses. And when the news of Phinehas and Hophni, Eli's sons, returned to town, and Eli was sitting on his stool beside the road, and along in this battle, this is when they captured the Ark of the Covenant. Because, like I was saying before, they thought God was on their side. And they looked at the Ark of the Covenant as some sort of lucky charm. And they grabbed it and they marched into war, and we already know how that turned out. They thought God was on their side, and they picked the Ark of the Covenant up and they carried it in, and they lost badly. And what was the result? They lost the Ark of the Covenant. It was captured. And when Eli heard about this, I can't help but wonder if he was more upset about the chest than his sons. I'm almost certain. Because in verse 13, he says, "For he was extremely worried about the chest of God." But in the next verse, he says, Eli heard the loud wailing and asked, "Why all this noise? Why the uproar?" And the man said to Eli, in verse 16, "I've just come from the front, barely escaping with my life." And Eli asked what happened. Then the messenger said, "Israel scattered before the Philistines. The defeat was catastrophic, with enormous losses. Your sons Hophni and Phinehas are dead, and the chest of the God is taken, captured." And at the words "chest of God," Eli fell back on his stool, and he died. And it says, Eli, in verse 18, it says, "Eli was an old man and very fat. When he fell, he broke his neck and died." So I guess it's just letting us know why just a fall could take out somebody. I guess it's letting us know by saying that he was fat, that he wasn't healthy. And now we're about to read of Eli's daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, who was pregnant and ready to deliver a baby. When she heard that the chest of God had been taken, her father-in-law's dead, her husband was dead, her husband's brother was dead, and she fell to her knees to give birth. She went into some hard labor, and she is actually about to die too. And her midwife says, "Don't be afraid. You've given birth to a son." And she named the boy Ichabod, which means glory is gone. For the chest of God, the Ark of the Covenant, was gone. Her father-in-law's dead, husband's dead. She named the boy Glory is gone, saying, "Glory is exiled from Israel since the chest of God was taken." Now, we might be thinking, oh no, the chest of God has been taken. What are we going to do now? That's what I was thinking. But then I quickly been reminded that God is very capable of taking care of himself. For we are about to read the havoc and chaos that God is going to wreak on the Philistines for having taken him. And they are going to be begging Israel to take him back. So the first thing that they do is that they have, I don't know, I guess it's a god named Dagon, but I guess they worship this, god. And so what they did was they put the Ark of the God next to I'm guessing it's a statue, some sort of idol that they worship of this Dagon. And so they put them next to each other, and they come back the next day, and the statue of Dagon is face down in front of the Ark of the Covenant. And I guess they're not thinking much of it at that point, but they pick him up and put him back where he belonged. And then the first thing, the next morning, they found him again, toppled and flat on his face before the chest of God. But this time, Dagon's head and arms were broken off, and they were strewn into the entrance, and only his torso was in one piece. And it says in Samuel chapter 5, verse 5, it says, "That's why even today, the priest of Dagon and visitors to the Dagon shrine in Ashdod avoid stepping on the threshold." And so this is just the first thing that's happening here. And next, God releases a plague. He devastates the people with tumors. He lets loose rats among them, and they're jumping from ships. Rats are swarming all over the city, and everyone is just deathly afraid. And one of the leaders said that the chest of God of Israel has to go. We can't do this, and they can't do that to their god, Dagon. And they're like, how can we get rid of this? And they came up with an idea. Like I said, they are going to beg the Israelites to take the chest of God back. So what did they do? They consulted with one of their leaders, and he gave them specific instructions. I find that part interesting. Very specific instructions on how to give it back. And he told them to bring gifts. And one of the gifts that they made were gold rats. And the other gift was gold tumors, just as the plagues that God sent upon them. And he set those gifts along with the Ark of the Covenant. But there was one more thing that they did. he says, and this was a part of his very specific instructions, and he says, so here's what you do. Take a brand new ox cart and 2 cows. But these 2 cows need to have never been harnessed. They should not be your ordinary ox cart. They should not be trained. And hitch those cows to the ox cart with the Ark of the Covenant and send it off. But watch them. If it goes towards the Israelite camp, then we know that this is God's work and to just let it be. But if it's not, then we know that God had nothing to do with it and it's just all been a bunch of accidents. And of course, the untrained cows led the Ark of the Covenant back home to Israel. Now, as soon as the Ark of the Covenant returned, they actually went to Beth Shemesh, and the Philistine leaders followed them to the outskirts. And the people of Beth Shemesh were harvesting wheat, and they looked up and they saw the chest. They were so happy. They came out, and what they did was they took the 2 cows and they sacrificed them as burnt offerings to God. And then the Levites took charge of the chest, and it was containing all the gold offerings and the sacrifices and gifts that the Philistine leaders were sent as like some sort of peace offering. But here's where they messed up. Their curiosity got the best of them, and they took a peek. They looked into the chest of God, and 70 of them died. And the whole town was in mourning, and even these people of Beth Shemesh were like, okay, who can stand before God, this holy God, and who can we take this chest to get it off our hands? And so next, they sent emissaries to Kirith, saying that the Philistines have returned the chest of God to come get it now. And that is how the Ark of the Covenant was both captured and returned in all of its glory and everything that led up to this moment where Samuel addresses the house of Israel. And he says, if you are truly serious about coming back to God, clean house, get rid of your foreign gods, your fertility goddesses, ground yourselves firmly in God and worship Him and Him alone, and He'll save you from the Philistine oppression. He is telling the people to come unto God. He is their prophet, and He is their deliverer, and He is now their judge, and He is telling them He is here to deliver them, and this is how they will save themselves from the Philistine oppression. That is to worship God, to love God once again, worship Him and worship Him alone. And they did. They did exactly as Samuel said. And next Samuel said, get everybody together to Mizpah, and I'll pray for you. And everybody pleaded with Samuel, pray with all your might. Don't let up. Pray to God, our God, and He'll save us from the boot of the Philistines. And then Samuel took a young lamb, not yet weaned, and offered it as a whole burnt offering to God. And then he prayed to God. And while Samuel was offering the sacrifice, the Philistines were actually coming within range. They were going to fight Israel. They were coming back for more war. But God seen this. And then God thundered a huge thunderclap and exploded it among the Philistines. And the Philistines panicked. And they all were bursting out into mass confusion. They booked it. They ran. They knew the power of God already. And maybe they thought that, but God's not on their side. Maybe they thought, okay, now they're getting cursed because they have the chest of God, whatever it may be. But they decided to come back, and God chased them out. And then in verse 12, it says, Samuel took a single rock and set it upright between Mizpah and Shin, and named it Ebenezer, the rock of help, saying that this marks the place where God helped us. And just as I was talking about with Hannah, as she gave praise, as her prayers were answered and she was dancing in her salvation, we see Samuel automatically taking a rock to celebrate this moment, calling it Ebenezer, and saying, this marks the place where God helped us. And this is another example that we should try not to take for granted all that we are given, and even more so to celebrate when things go right for us, or maybe even rethinking about what it means for things to go right for us. And then chapter 7 ends by letting us know that Samuel gave solid leadership to Israel his entire life. We've seen a lot of different judges, a lot of different prophets, and each of them had their thing. And I'm seeing Samuel as a very spiritual person. He has that spiritual leadership, not so much military strength and strategy and all of this, but he is a very faithful servant. And he is leading Israel with solid leadership through this skill or trait. And every year he went on a circuit from Bethel to Gilgal to Mizpah. And he gave leadership to Israel in each of these places. But he would always return to Ramah, where he lived, and presided from there. And this is where he built an altar to God. Because as he told the people, that is how we will beat the Philistines, by returning to praise and worship God. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you enjoyed this Bible study as much as I did, and I hope you were able to take a little bit of the golden nuggets that I tried to dig up. And I thank you for joining me and giving me your support, and I thank you for following Jesus Christ and attempting to be a covenant leader in God's army. And I thank you for all that you do when you decide to open up your Bibles or turn on a podcast or take another step towards the gospel, Jesus Christ. And I thank you for joining me once again on this podcast, and I hope that you're able to join me again on my next Bible study next week.
Have a great day. Aloha.